With all of this news and actual story relating to the hunters being added to the game recently, I'd like to go back and review all of the encounters we've had with them through both the Division 1 and 2 to see if we're any closer to being able to determine who they are, what role they have played, and what their purpose will be in the coming days. We first meet up with the hunters in the survival game mode, in the Division 1 earlier on in the story. Agents are stranded in the middle of Manhattan during a snowstorm after their helicopter crashes. They have no gear or supplies, and due to injury from the accident, they are suffering from sepsis, which will kill them within the hour if they are unable to escape. Regardless, the agents have a mission to recover a set of experimental antivirals and extract via helicopter. However, if they make it that far and manage to fire off the flare gun, a new elite type of enemy appears, and their objective at this point is pretty clear: to stop us from getting away. But their reasons for doing so aren't so obvious. All we know about them is that they are covered in agent watches, wear a mask, and fight unlike anything else we have encountered up until that point, with tech that seems to supersede our own. It was unclear whether the antivirals had anything to do with it, as they would still attack even if the antivirals hadn't been found. Following this, as expected, the speculation started flowing. The hunters are loyal to Aaron Keener, former First Wave agents, Russians, the Third Wave, and so on. But there really wasn't much to work with, so anyone's guess was just as viable as the next. Following Survival, possibly due to their popularity, we saw the hunters play their part in a number of other areas. In 1.8, the Division 1's last major update, the agents had a chance of encountering them in the underground, where they could randomly spawn mid-mission, as well as the Resistance game mode, where they could appear alongside other enemies at certain waves. They would also appear at the end of legendary difficulty missions. But all of these additions really did seem to lean more on their popularity among players than actually being a part of their mysterious story. Even now, with that little bit more information we've received recently, these encounters appear more based on gameplay than story focus. Truth be told, it could be exactly the same with their appearance in Survival, at least at this stage. When the Division 2 was released, players were quick to discover that there were a number of hunters that could be spawned after following various actions on the map. And when I say quick, I mean much faster than was intended by the developers. I think a lot of them were figured out during the beta. But these were more of a puzzle and an Easter egg at this stage, a way to collect masks. However, over time, agents started noticing them popping up around the map, usually from a distance, but not in a hostile way. In fact, if you were able to get close, they would usually just disappear. It's like they were watching us. The first official story recognition the hunters were given was quite early on in the Division 2 in a side mission called Agent Edwards Support. It had been a while since I'd played through it, so I created a new character just so I could run through it again and make sure I hadn't missed anything. It's at a demolition site where a half-destroyed block office was briefly used by the hyenas. Agent Edwards was investigating the area. He has requested backup, which is why our agent is travelling in to meet him there. Before making it to the site, we are pinged by Manny, saying that an agent called Andrew Edwards is requesting assistance inside a control point. The building is eerily quiet, but there is an SHD request signal alert. Heading deeper into the building, the beeping starts to speed up, and the communication signal with Manny is starting to break up. Suddenly the lights shut off, then almost immediately turn back on, now with some spotlights in the center office pointed up towards a body that is hanging from the ceiling. However, before the agent can investigate, there is a familiar sound that comes from the back of the room, followed by an EMP effect that renders SHD tech useless for a few seconds. Ahead of the agents appears a hostile enemy, labelled simply as Unknown. But based on the icon and the way it moves, this is obviously a hunter. The agent puts up a good fight, but is vastly underpowered and outmatched. But rather than finishing off the agent, The hunter instead places the agent into a shock status effect and just struts around the room for a couple of seconds before vanishing shortly after. The hunter had its chance to finish the job, but instead chose to taunt, almost like it was trying to edge us on, and then leaves. After he's gone, contact with Manny is suddenly re-established. Edwards has been dead for a while, and it didn't sound like his last moments were particularly pleasant. Given the way he has been found, it is safe to assume he has been tortured. Interesting that his daughter's status is unconfirmed, but given that she is still listed as a dependent, I don't think that this is significant. What is more interesting here is that he was supposedly tortured and eventually killed by this hunter, who would eventually fight us but leave us alive. It could be speculated that it wasn't this hunter that killed him, but given that the hyenas have long since left the building and he hasn't been dead for long, it's more than likely that he, or she, was the reason for Edward's death. So why did this hunter refrain from killing us? Was this a test? This does pair up with a number of reports around hunters in DC that are simply watching us, patiently, from afar. But then why was Edwards executed? What's different about us? The next time we would officially hear anything regarding the hunters would be following the Warlords of New York DLC during the Season 3 Manhunt, where we are hunting down Barden Schaefer. A hunter would appear when fighting each target. It wasn't just fighting us, but also the enemy target we were chasing down. This same hunter would eventually turn up during the final target, Barden Schaefer. But fortunately, we were able to take it down before it managed to get to Schaefer, though it would appear that it was actually working with Schaefer. Barden would survive this encounter, barely, and be captured by the SHD. Through the Fei Lao comms, it was discovered that this hunter had been organized by Natalia and McManus to help and then dispose of issues. The issues being the rogue agents that Fei had organized to work under Schaefer, and then eventually Schaefer himself, after he began questioning Natalia. The hunter was a cleanup crew for this particular manhunt, a manhunt consisting of rogue agents that were helping the Black Tusk, agents that were put in place by Fei Lao, who was working under her own agenda. Hidden Alliance reveals and confirms the cooperation between Natalia Sokolova and Calvin McManus. McManus turns out to be the Secretary of Homeland Security, and he has his own personal unit of covert special operatives, known to us as the Hunters. Being Homeland Security, McManus is not only aware of the SHD from its very early days, but is somewhat responsible for them. After one of his hunters was killed by division agents on Coney Island, who was chasing down Schaefer, he is looking to recruit. Natalia provides him with a list of individuals under her control that he could choose from. These all consisted of former division agents, apart from one, Jack Bonney, and this was the one that McManus decided to run with. In the final target mission of Hidden Alliance, we end up teaming up with the target himself, True Sun Officer Frederick Lewis. He warns us of someone called the Recruiter, and appears to be far better informed on what's going on than we are. Throughout the mission we hear of Jack Bonney, the latest hunter recruit, being put through a test, with the hunter appearing from time to time, just watching and assessing. Long story short, we kill Bonney, so it wouldn't be all that unreasonable to assume he has now failed his test. But the hunter recruiter, he doesn't do much about it. He just continues to watch us, and then eventually disappears. That is, unless you are like this one Reddit user who managed to get killed by the hunter. I tried to replicate this myself, albeit on a lower difficulty than the previous time I ran it, to try and speed up the process. It wasn't easy to do, and was obviously not the intended way of playing the mission, but once successfully killed by the recruiter, the following death screen popped up. Zhang Ziya. I'm not going to go into too much depth here, as I could spend the next hour talking about this character in Chinese mythology. But he is an important figure in Chinese history. He assisted in overthrowing the Shang dynasty and establishing the Zhou dynasty in 1046 BC. Zhou was the longest dynasty in Chinese history, which set the feudalism, the rites, and music culture that Confucianism highly appreciated, and was the period where the most Chinese philosophical schools were well developed. While I believe this name to be more of an interesting Easter egg, much like a number of the exotic and named weapon captions we see out there is a certain amount of familiarity behind the history of Zhang Ziya and what McManus and Natalia are trying to achieve. To overthrow the current government and create something better, at least in their own eyes. I'm not going to name the individual, but a writer I respect once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, a villain needs to feel justified in their actions. No one thinks they're evil, but sometimes what brings people joy is problematic and dangerous. So a name like this Zhang Ziya being given to a character like the Recruiter just further shows the belief they have in what they're doing. The overthrowing of an evil, misled government to instate a new world order. So with this recap, there are a few questions I have, and this doesn't just involve the hunters, but the story itself. However, to be fair, the hunters at this stage seem to be becoming a major part of the story now. How many of the missing first wave agents became hunters, if any at all? We know a lot of them joined with Keener, died at his hands, or died in the aftermath of the virus being released. But there are numerous more that haven't been accounted for. Does this have anything to do with what Keener was telling us about for all this time, with us having no idea what was coming? And does the rogue agent network and Anna have anything to do with it? ELLIS's memoirs mention something called the button, which is a common term referring to the nuclear football, emergency satchel, or the black box. This is a briefcase of which the contents are to be used by the President of the United States to authorize a nuclear attack. How does this involve McManus and the hunters? The fact that ELLIS mentions Natalia and McManus in relation to it implies that there is more to come regarding it. At this stage, I'm really hanging on to the fact that McManus chose not to recruit one of the rogue agents that Natalia offered to him, and was more willing to give the younger, less experienced Jack Bonney a go. I don't think it's that he doesn't have former agents in his ranks, but that he has had a few issues with them in the past, and has now chosen to keep them separate from the Hunter program. It could even be that this is what Keener was talking about. Perhaps he was approached, and as he learned more about what they were doing, this is when he really went off the rails. He could see what was coming. He started recruiting for his cause, and setting up his own Isaac network, known as Anna, that could work outside of McManus and the SHD's control. Keener may have initially parted ways with the division because he was left behind in the Dark Zone when the government pulled out the JTF, but now I believe there is more to the story. Keener learned of McManus, Natalia, the President, and the button. He took it upon himself to fight back against something that the division have no hope in stopping with their current structure, particularly with McManus being somewhat at the helm. There have been a lot of questions regarding the way Keener went out, the way he suddenly became the classic comic book supervillain, with a plan to release his new and improved supervirus on the city of New York. What if this wasn't what it looked like from the outside? What if this was more about targeting McManus, Natalia, and or the hunters, or maybe a way of bringing them all to one location, Liberty Island, where they could be dealt with, isolated from the rest of the city? Keener was never meant to survive that encounter, and he seemed quite comfortable with that. However, I don't think he ever intended on firing his virus into the city with the intention of wiping out civilians. Or maybe it wasn't meant to leave Liberty Island at all. But I don't think that any of what we saw was intended for us either. Regardless, he used it as an opportunity to show us Isaac's flaws. I think we ruined his plans on that island, but not in the way we think we did. Even if he did end up releasing the virus into the city, this was collateral damage he was willing to take, especially when considering the potential nuclear fallout that McManus and Natalia could be planning on causing. Anyway, long story short, I believe Keener was approached a long time ago, and because he's been such a huge thorn in McManus' side, he has chosen not to repeat that mistake and avoid SHD agents altogether. So why then are the hunters watching us? Well, firstly, they haven't been ordered to take us out yet. Secondly, they aren't mindless drones. These are highly trained and experienced Special Force operatives. They still think for themselves, and while they take their orders from McManus right now, maybe it won't always be this way. It certainly wouldn't be the first faction in the division to split away from command. We, the player agent, are the strongest and most resilient agent they've come across. Screw you, Kelso, it's true. So perhaps they see something here. Maybe they are watching all agents they come across, like Edwards, but depending on how they react, they are choosing to execute those they deem unworthy. I think they see something in us, and their leader, the recruiter, won't allow them to take us out. Or maybe this has nothing to do with Keener at all. Maybe he was just that unhinged former agent we saw at the end, who was attempting to fire a supervirus missile into the city. Perhaps the button doesn't just refer to the use of nuclear weapons. It could be talking about using biological weapons, something similar to what Keener was planning on using. Or maybe even a way of mass spreading a cure. What better way to show you're the best option for the future of the country than by providing a cure to the problem that started it all? On the organizational chart of the US federal government, the Strategic Homeland Division is formally listed as part of the Department of Homeland Security. However, the division reports directly to, and only to, the President of the United States. But in saying that, the non-classified elements of Directive 51 specify that, in the event of a catastrophic emergency, all governmental power will be transferred to the President, top advisors, and a committee including the Vice President, National Security Advisor, National Continuity Coordinator, the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, and finally, the Continuity Policy Coordination Committee, chaired by a senior director from the Homeland Security Council staff. So with the President and the Vice President now dead, as well as various other members of the Presidential Advisory Board, it makes sense that McManus now sees himself as the new director in charge of the SHD. But all of this started before he had much control of them, so he's been preparing and establishing his own counterforce for the SHD agents, a unit even more secretive in nature than the division themselves. While the Hunters have been used as somewhat of a cleanup crew for not just rogue agents, but the SHD in general, this doesn't appear to be their main objective. Are they simply McManus's Praetorian Guard while he worked through the details of obtaining power of the US government? Or are they destined for much more in the coming days? Yes, he has control over Natalia and the Black Tusk, but these are just the force that make up the numbers of his wider army. The Hunters are his unit, loyal only to him. At least for now. Obviously there is a huge part of this story that is still to be revealed. Some of it sitting with Barton Schaefer, who still hasn't woken from the coma we put him in, but also more, still to be revealed by McManus himself. For now, we're as close as we've ever been to learning the origin and identity of the Hunters. But as far as their future role goes, only time will tell. This has been my recap of the Hunters faction as a whole, from the early days of the Division 1 up until where we are now, halfway through Year 4 of the Division 2. It goes without saying that we'll hear more about them in the future, but for now, this is all we have to work with. Given what we've more recently learnt about them, what do you think the future story holds for the Hunters? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!